They called it the Dream Factory, but dreams, like hair, could be manufactured. Under the heat of the arc lights, every detail had to hold. Skin gleamed as if the pores themselves had been polished. Eyes caught the reflections of carefully placed spotlights, turning into mirrors for the fantasies of millions. And hair was not a birthright here. It was a costume, a crown, an unspoken contract between star and audience that perfection would never slip. For most, wigs were just another tool, a way to transform into a character, to become a queen one week, a schoolgirl the next. But for a few, they were armor, a shield not against critics, but against the slow betrayals of time and biology. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Beneath the curls, sculpted by invisible hands, there was a truth almost no one was allowed to see. The studios protected these secrets with a loyalty born of profit. Makeup artists learned the art of silence. Hairdressers signed contracts, but more importantly, they understood the weight of discretion. A wig was fitted, glued, and styled until it seemed to grow from the scalp itself. The mirror reflected the version the public adored, while the real hairline, hidden beneath, remained untouched by the spotlight. No one dared ask. She never told, until it was too late. In that silence lived both fragility and strength. The fragility of guarding a truth in a world that devoured imperfections, and the strength of walking onto a set every morning, knowing the illusion must hold. The role made her famous. It also broke her. And yet, in that fragile space between truth and performance, these stars found their power. The wigs didn't just hide, they completed the transformation. They clapped when she entered the room. But no one noticed when she left. Somewhere in that absence lay the most human part of her, the part the audience never saw, but which made her shine all the brighter. Under the smoky light of mid-century Hollywood, Yul Brynner was not yet the man audiences would remember, not yet the figure whose bare scalp would gleam like a crown in The King and I, not yet the icon who made baldness into something regal. In those early days, he was simply another actor in the labyrinth of the studio system, where appearance was both a passport and a cage. The rules were unwritten but absolute. Leading men had hair, not just hair, but hair that fell in perfect camera-loving waves, each strand a silent reassurance to audiences that they were looking at a hero. So, they gave him wigs. Thick, glossy, and perfectly shaped, the hairpieces sat with studied precision, parting where the studio said they should part, curling just enough to catch the light. Under them, Brynner played the romantic leads they offered, the brooding aristocrat, the dashing stranger, the man whose appeal was as conventional as the hair he wore. The wigs were not vanity, but armor. In a town where beauty was a uniform, he wore the regulation willingly, knowing it was the price of entry. But there was always something in him that did not quite belong to the rules. Behind the cameras, he would slip the wig from his head, feeling the cool air touch the skin that the public would not yet see. He was already living in that bare truth, long before audiences would be ready for it. Perhaps he knew, even then, that the most powerful version of himself was the one the studio kept hidden. When the time came, he did not just remove the hairpiece. He removed the last veil between himself and the world. He walked onto the stage with his head uncovered, its shape catching the light like a polished stone, the stage lamps turning what had been a liability into a beacon. He did not soften it with apologies or explanations. Instead, he stood taller, shoulders squared, the glint on his scalp becoming a kind of halo. The shift was immediate, almost electric. The man who had once worn hair to fit in now commanded attention without it. Casting agents began to see what the wigs had hidden, a presence both severe and magnetic, a beauty that did not need to resemble anyone else's. The absence of hair became not a lack, but a weapon. It made him unforgettably distinct, a silhouette that could never be mistaken for another's. Audiences too began to understand. They saw in him a kind of defiance, not the loud rebellion of scandal or spectacle, but the quieter, more enduring rebellion of authenticity. In an era that demanded masks, he had removed his. His baldness became a choice, not a condition, and in that choice was a kind of power no costume could replicate. Looking back, the wigs were never a betrayal of himself, only a stage in the performance of becoming. He wore them to enter the room, then took them off to own it. What began as conformity ended as transformation, and what had once been hidden became the very thing that made him immortal. And yet, the story of Yul Brynner's bald crown is not just about style or defiance. It is about the moment a man decides that the truest version of himself is worth more than the safest version. Under the bright breath of the stage lights, his head shone like a crown of shadows, proof that sometimes the most powerful thing you can wear is nothing at all. In the dim glow of the studio backlots, Humphrey Bogart moved like a man carved from the very smoke that curled around him. The trench coat was armor, the cigarette a punctuation mark, and the tilted fedora, always the fedora, a crown in disguise. In frame after frame, from the Maltese Falcon to Casablanca, it sat low, casting a shadow that seemed born for him alone. To audiences, it was part of the myth. To Bogart, it was also something quieter, a shield. Long before he was Rick Blaine or Sam Spade, the mirror had begun to tell him another story. His hairline, once unremarkable, had started its slow retreat. In an industry that measured leading men against a narrow, unforgiving image, every fraction of an inch lost could feel like a headline waiting to happen. So the studio, masters of illusion, stepped in. Wigs, partial hairpieces, careful styling, all folded into his costume as seamlessly as a prop gun or a glass of bourbon. On set, the transformation was complete. The pieces were expertly blended, as precise as the lighting cues that defined his jawline. They didn't try to turn him into someone else. They simply framed him, trimming away distractions so that the audience could focus on what really mattered. That voice, that stare, the sense that he could hold his own in any room. The irony was delicious in its subtlety. Bogart, the man who could not be bought, bullied, or seduced into compromise, was himself quietly protected by one. His fans saw strength, defiance, a man who never flinched. They didn't see the careful ritual before each scene, the hairdresser's gentle adjustments, the quiet cooperation between star and craftsman to make sure the illusion held. He never spoke of it. Why would he? For Bogart, the truth was never the point. The story was. Audiences didn't buy tickets for the man in the makeup chair. They came for the man in the fedora, who could look into Ingrid Bergman's eyes and make you believe the world had stopped turning. The secret didn't diminish that magic. If anything, it proved how hard won it was. Off-screen, the hat often stayed on, as if the line between character and man had thinned. Friends didn't ask, colleagues looked away. The fedora became not just part of his image, but part of him, a portable shadow that followed wherever the lights might fall. And so, in the smoky half-light of cinema history, Bogart remains untouched. The hat tilts, the cigarette glows, and the man beneath is exactly as the world remembers him, because that was the way he wanted to be remembered. Somewhere in that choice lies the heart of Humphrey Bogart, a man who knew that illusions weren't lies, but tools. And in the quiet between takes, when the hat came off and the lights cooled, he knew he had given the audience exactly what they came for, without ever letting them see what he had kept for himself. Fred Astaire never seemed to touch the ground. He didn't so much dance as drift, his feet tracing patterns so light they seemed immune to gravity's pull. In every frame, he was immaculate, tails pressed to perfection, bow tie exact, shoes gleaming as if they'd been polished between steps. And above it all, the hair. Perfectly parted, perfectly smooth. Not a strand out of place no matter how many spins or leaps he gave the audience. It looked effortless, like everything else he did. But perfection, in Astaire's world, was never an accident. By the time he was dancing through his most beloved musicals, the reality was quietly at odds with the image. His hair had begun its slow retreat, thinning under the relentless demands of light and time. In another man, it might have been an inconvenience. For Astaire, whose artistry depended on the illusion of flawlessness, it became a problem to solve. And he solved it with the same precision he gave to his choreography. Hairpieces were worked into his image so seamlessly they might as well have been part of the man himself. They were crafted with an artisan's eye, shaped to suit the angles of his face, secured so they could weather even the most energetic tap sequence. In the dressing room, as makeup was applied and costumes adjusted, a skilled hand would set the piece in place. Once it was on, it was no longer a wig. It was part of the uniform, as essential as the cane in Top Hat or the silk scarf in Swing Time. Astaire never wore it as a deception, but as an extension of the promise he made to his audience, that when they came to see him, they would be transported into a world without visible imperfections. The hairpiece, like the perfect cut of his tails or the gleam of his cufflinks, was just one more brushstroke in a flawless painting, and yet there was nothing vain about it. Off-screen, Astaire was famously modest, even shy. He wasn't chasing beauty for its own sake. He was protecting the spell. He understood that the joy his performances gave depended on every detail being right, every frame balanced, every movement unmarred. If that required a hidden scaffold of hair and wire, so be it. Perhaps that's why his magic endures. He didn't try to convince us that perfection was real. He made us believe in it anyway, because he wore it lightly, with a grace that made it feel possible, if only for the length of a song. And in that way, Fred Astaire's greatest performance may not have been the dances themselves, but the seamless way he kept the dream intact, letting us float with him above the small truths the lights never showed. Bing Crosby's voice could soften the edges of winter. It was the sound of fireside evenings and quiet snowfalls, a warm baritone that rolled through radios and theatres like a familiar friend's knock at the door. You didn't just hear him, you felt him. On screen, he carried that same ease, the kind that made every room he entered seem a little more at ease too. Part of the image was in his eyes, calm and unhurried, and part of it was in the easy wave of hair that peeked from beneath his hat. It was a small detail, but in Hollywood, small details could be everything. What audiences never guessed was that the wave was not always his own. Crosby's hair began thinning early, a quiet shift noticed first in the mirror, then under the unforgiving glare of studio lights. For a man whose livelihood rested as much on image as on sound, the change could have been a threat. But Crosby, pragmatic as ever, treated it instead as just another arrangement to perfect. Wigs and partial hairpieces became part of the costume, blending into his look with a naturalness that fooled not only his audience, but the camera itself. Hats helped too, fedoras, flat caps, and straw boaters that fit the roles he played while subtly guarding the secret beneath. Yet he never seemed guarded. That was his gift. The illusion was there, but it was never the performance. The real magic lay in the way he could lean against a piano, smile into the lens, and make you feel as though the whole world was in on something gentle and good. His fans never asked what was real, and he never explained. Why would he? The voice was the truth they came for. Smooth, effortless, and exactly what they needed it to be. Perhaps that was the truest part of Bing Crosby. Not the hair, not the charm, but the quiet understanding that what lasts in the memory is not what you see, but what you feel. And in that, he was flawless. Burt Reynolds didn't just play leading men, he embodied them. The sly, sideways grin, the easy confidence, the mustache that seemed to have its own billing, all of it combined into an image that defined a decade. He was the man who could win the race, win the girl, and win over the audience without breaking a sweat. On screen, he was effortless. Off screen, there was effort. Invisible, precise, and guarded. Above that mustache, Reynolds carried a quieter truth. His famously thick, dark hair was not always entirely his own. Hairpieces, custom crafted and expertly blended, became part of his working life long before the public ever suspected. In the 70s, when virility was practically a leading man's second name, such an admission could have been career-altering. Reynolds understood this better than anyone. The illusion was not a matter of vanity alone. It was professional stewardship. The Burt Reynolds his audience adored existed as much in their imagination as on the screen, and he protected that image the way a stagehand guards the backdrop. The wigs were works of art, matched to his natural colour, shaped to hold up under hot lights and fast cars, close-ups, and chase scenes. They allowed him to step into each role with the same unshakable outline, the same instantly recognizable silhouette. What's striking is not the disguise itself, but the generosity behind it. Reynolds wasn't hiding for himself. He was holding the curtain closed for the audience, preserving the magic they paid to see. Over time, the man and the mask became inseparable, not because he had lost himself, but because he had so carefully woven the two together. In the end, the charm was never just in the hair, the mustache, or even the smile. It was in the way Burt Reynolds understood the contract between star and audience, to give them the fantasy they came for, and to never let them see the seams. Outro chapter: The truth beneath the lights. The wigs, the hairpieces, the carefully crafted illusions. They were never acts of deception so much as gestures of devotion. In Hollywood's golden era, beauty was a language, and every strand of hair was a line in the script. The audience might remember the words, the music, the lighting, but it was the complete picture, every polished detail that made the dream hold. These men understood this in their bones. They knew that cinema was a fragile enchantment, and that sometimes, to protect it, you had to wear the mask so completely that even you forgot where it ended. In dressing rooms, under the hum of bulbs, skilled hands worked with quiet mastery, blending hairlines, adjusting texture, anchoring pieces so that not a single shift would betray the magic under hot lights or mid-spin in a dance. It wasn't vanity, it was a kind of stewardship. They were caretakers of the fantasy the public had come to expect. The disguise was not to shield themselves from shame, but to shield the audience from a world too ordinary to sustain the spell. And in time, the truth would slip into the open. A line in a memoir, a confession in an interview, a photograph where the years had softened the edges of the illusion. But by then, it didn't matter. The films were already etched into memory. The performances sealed in the amber of celluloid. We remembered them exactly as they had wanted us to, not because they had fooled us, but because they had given us something we wanted to believe in. The screen has no appetite for the smaller truths we hide. It demands the larger truth, the one in the glint of an eye, the curl of a smile, the way a man can stand as if the world were exactly as it should be. That truth is made of posture, timing, tone, and yes, sometimes of hair that is as much costume as the suit or gown. Beneath every hairpiece in those years was not just a bare scalp, but a soul that knew the worth of a perfect illusion. They wore these pieces not to deny who they were, but to ensure that the story they told stayed unbroken from first frame to last. It was an art form as exacting as the performances themselves. Invisible when done well, but essential to the whole. And maybe that is the most human truth of all, that sometimes the masks we wear are not to deceive, but to preserve, that the things we hide are not betrayals, but gifts meant to keep the dream intact for just a little longer. In the soft flicker of the projector's light, With the music rising and the audience leaning forward, the illusion was complete, and we loved them for it. Not because we didn't know better, but because we didn't want to.